Welcome to this year's CASA's first panel conversation series, Fostering Care. My name is Veronica Krupnik, and I'm the Mentorship, Advocacy, and Peer Support Program Coordinator with CASA First, based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm so honored to have had the opportunity to organize, collaborate, and host this year's panel series. I've been joined by 11 of my fellow lived experience advocates and leaders from across the country. Each of these incredible and hardworking individuals are working tirelessly to transform and improve the system to better serve children and families. The intention of this project is to bring awareness, empathy, and compassion back to the humans whose lives have been impacted by the child welfare system previously or currently. This collaborative project is based on the human experiences, the story, and the hearts of each panelist. Yes, we have come together on a project, but in reality, we have come together as a community to share our story. And we hope that you are able to take some of what we have to share with you all. We hope it resonates and it supports you in your own life and in your own work. With that being said, I would also like to pause to say that while we are speaking our truth and we are speaking from our hearts, that also with that may come emotionally triggering or emotionally difficult experiences to hear. So we ask that you take this panel series at your own pace and to take care and be gentle with yourself. In this first panel, Navigating Lived Experience and Advocacy, we will share with you our experiences with the reality, challenges, and complexities that come with balancing our personal experiences within foster care and working within that same system as advocates and leaders. We will also speak on the importance of things like social capital and community, the image of advocacy and the reality of that experience, navigating imposter syndrome, and last but not least, what is our hope for the future of the foster care system? I'm thrilled to be joined by three advocates who I admire and look up to and have had the privilege of learning alongside for several years. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce these three individuals before we get into our conversation. Keonda Johnson spent 19 years in the Florida's foster care system, including time in extended care. During that time, she experienced over 20 different placements in group homes. Currently, Keonda is studying political science and working at United Way in an AmeriCorps Vista position where she supports financial literacy for young people and adults. She has advocated within Florida Youth Shine for several years, serving as events and meetings chair, speaking to state legislature, and working to pass several pieces of legislation, including one focused on normalcy. Keonda serves as an NYTD reviewer and engaged her peers in the Congressional Shadow Program with the National Foster Youth Institute in 2017 as a pod leader after attending herself in 2015. Keonda has also served for several years as a member of the National Foster Youth and Alumni Policy Council. Angela Quijada Banks is an NAACP Image Awards nominee and an American Award-winning author of the Black Foster Youth Handbook. As a highly requested transformational speaker and certified holistic health coach, she has touched thousands with her message to alchemize your pain to purpose and power. As a nationally recognized community leader and philanthropist, she started her own company and movement, Soulful Liberation, which has impacted over 30,000 people to revolutionize historically oppressive systems through holistic health and healing trauma with coaching, workshops, training, and programming. She is also an adventurer and wife to her amazing husband, Michael, a United States Marine. Brittany Lee experienced 17 foster homes in the span of 17 years of her childhood. Brittany's current aspiration is to utilize her growth and knowledge gains from resilience, community involvement, and employment opportunities with youth who have experienced foster care. She consistently involves herself in community conversations on child welfare and engages in opportunities where she can increase her understanding on how to best leverage her experience and meet her goals. One of those major goals is to become more educated on the subject of racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. Brittany hopes to work from the inside to come up with simple solutions to counteract racial inequality and institutionalized structural racism that affects all youth in foster care today. Having grown up living with other children in the system from various backgrounds and at all kinds of emotional, mental, and spiritual levels, Brittany has unconditional compassion in her heart to give to the youth in the communities similar to those in which she grew up in, as well as on a national and global level. She wishes to be a role model and a source of support to youth experiencing foster care, to help them navigate all of the ups and downs, and to be the someone that Brittany needed when she herself was younger. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here for our panel on lived experience and advocacy. I'm really excited about this conversation and to be joined by three incredible leaders in child welfare. And so we're just going to go ahead and hop right into our conversation for today because we have a lot to get through. So for our panel, our first question for today is, why is it important for advocacy spaces to support young people's social capital and aftercare? And also, what would you say is aftercare?
So it's important to support young people's social capital, meaning the relationships that they have within the system. And also if they're looking to try and share their story and their experiences, because I mean, that's just the right thing to do. I mean, you know, when you really think about youth, like in my own experience, when I was mute and I was struggling to not only find my own voice, but really be able to express myself and share my story, even though I wanted to. It was hard to do that coming from a place of being mute and always feeling like my story, my voice, my opinions didn't matter. So holding space to connect with youth on that level is incredibly healing for youth and for folks with lived experience. But it's not just, you know, how can we engage this youth's perspective, story, opinion, and then we give them a $25 gift card. It's really, you know, looking at the importance of why this human being, not just their story, is so valuable to the shift in the narrative, whether that is in your organization, systemically, interpersonally, or just in general as the youth, as the youth's own experience and journey and vision. So for their own life. As far as aftercare, thinking about my experience in advocacy from 16 to now 10 years later, really looking at how I didn't feel supported in those spaces. And although I had the support a lot of times from the folks with lived experience as well, I didn't feel as supported by those organizations and those spaces that were supposed to uplift what I was sharing. So what it was about, you know, what do I have to offer? I felt it was very transactional with the organization versus me believing that they actually cared about me as a human, as a person, as a young person. And aftercare is really like, what are you doing after the fact that this young person has shared their perspective, their story, their experience? We reopen those wounds, you know, and I mean, is there any after support with therapy or a healing space to debrief about it, and not just debrief, following up the week after, you know, and saying, hey, are you okay? And you can't bring a youth into a space and talk about homelessness and they're currently experiencing homelessness and expect them to be like fine after you give them, you know, $10, $25, even $50 gift card. Like that's not sustainable for their whole well-being. So I think on that end, as a youth, and for those that are older and have been doing the work for a while, like really looking at the professional expertise and skills and experience, and really making sure that if you're bringing folks that have lived experience and fostering that community piece, that they are also paid well for that expertise, for that consulting a lot of times. And what does that really look like in your own policy and procedures in your organization? Is that really something that you value and putting dollars behind? Or is it something that, I mean, it just ends up being a form of tokenizing otherwise. So just really engaging with folks with lived experience that have also expertise in speaking in, you know, because after a while that you're doing advocacy, it does become a skill. So, I mean, that's something that is definitely a professional fee behind it. So yeah, I'm going to pass it on to my other panel mate.
I agree with a lot of what you said. And to echo that, like, I just think it's important for and kind of repeat the question too. It's important for advocacy spaces to support young people's social capital, simply because they're asking for labor from young people. And, you know, historically, you know, someone in their like as young as 16, 17, like around the ages that like some of us here in this space have started advocating as young as, it's not reasonable to invite someone so vulnerable, young, into a space and not give them, you know, what they're worth and what they're due. So just to echo that for sure, like I totally agree. And then as far as like aftercare, like the kind of feelings that we're left with when we are on kind of like maybe an emotional high, building relationships with other former foster youth, feeling less alone in such specific things like than we ever have, like all of those benefits, like you said, Angela or Angela, about like youth, you building relationships with each other, you know, we don't really get that warmth. We don't really get that emotional connectedness with the organizations, nor do I see them, you know, outright encourage that. And I think that's a part of healing, to bring multiple of us, you know, into one space, which often organizations can and do. I think is you have a responsibility. You have to, you know, not only like assume the responsibilities and lead with good intentions, but ask the people who you're inviting into the space what they need to be comfortable in the space. I think it's kind of like the hype and like DEI coming up around the world now, like with organizations, like we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, feels like more than ever on a large scale and at the corporate scale, in the nonprofit scale. But we still have to think about like what integration really meant, and like rooting that back into like foster youth. When you're inviting them into these organizations, this is already likely a person who is intersectionally a part of special populations. So they need special attention, special care, and especially because predominantly these spaces are not always reflecting the youth they're inviting in. Yeah, just to highlight all the more, like there's responsibilities that organizations and advocacy spaces have to do this. And I don't think it should be done just out of obligation either. If they truly value us and our stories, then it should just be a given. It should just be something they want to do. as well. And I think that's all a part of aftercare. I think that's a part of like, that's what the debrief after the debrief looks like the really check-in of like, how are you? Because I know we talked about like sharing our stories can sometimes bring us back to those moments of whatever we're sharing. We could be talking about as something as vague as sexism in foster care, like gendered attention that youth may get, something like that. And we could be all the way back in time thinking of a specific time that we experienced something like that. And so even just general topics that we tend to stay on in advocacy spaces still can bring us back to a specific space, a specific place and time, and we need that aftercare. So yeah, I just wanted to add on to that and say that. And for anyone who wants to share, yeah.
All right, so for me, when I think about social capital and the importance of it, I think about it in this way, like so no matter what your experience was in a child welfare system, there was some type of trauma. So we're taking youth and we're taking kids away from situations where they were, even if it was not an ideal situation at home, they had friends, they had community. So we're taking them away from there and we're placing them with a bunch of strangers and just saying, okay, this is great, this is what it needs to be. So it's important because as humans, we all want to be accepted. So when we join these advocacy groups and we join these different organizations, we're doing this because we want to help the system, but then we also want to feel that, like, you know, our voice mattered. We want to feel like we matter. We don't want to just feel you're taking people who already had a traumatic experience, who have already been used by the system for their politics and political gain. So it's important to make sure that when someone decides like, hey, you know what, I'm going to go around telling a bunch of strangers my innermost trauma, my innermost secrets, my innermost pain, I don't think that it's crazy to expect that you get treated with respect for that. Expect that you understand that it takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of humility, and a lot of just willing to be like, you know what, this sucks, but I want to help people. So making sure that there's an atmosphere for them to feel like, you know what, I'm not going to use you like the system used you. I'm not going to use you like everyone else has used you. And I'm going to make sure that you know that your voice not only matters, but it is taken seriously. Social capital, that's what comes to mind. As far as aftercare, we've given, like I believe Brittany, you said it, that, you know, most people have been doing this for years. So we've given you years of our life, years of reliving the same traumatic incidents over and over and over. I don't think that it's foolish to expect that you not only compensate us well, but also like check on us. Don't just drop us off and don't just use. At the end of the day, I think that's what it boils down to me. Don't just use people. Don't make us think that, okay, you know what, they're right. Like everyone's always going to use me, and don't just further intensify the trauma that we've already experienced by just dropping us like a bad egg. So for me, when I think about social capital and the importance of it, I think about it in this way, like so no matter what your experience was in a child welfare system, there was some type of trauma. So we're taking youth and we're taking kids away from situations where they were, even if it was not an ideal situation at home, they had friends, they had community. So we're taking them away from there and we're placing them with a bunch of strangers and just saying, okay, this is great, this is what it needs to be. So it's important because as humans, we all want to be accepted. So when we join these advocacy groups and we join these different organizations, we're doing this because we want to help the system, but then we also want to feel that, like, you know, our voice mattered. We want to feel like we matter. We don't want to just feel you're taking people who already had a traumatic experience, who have already been used by the system for their politics and political gain. So it's important to make sure that when someone decides like, hey, you know what, I'm going to go around telling a bunch of strangers my innermost trauma, my innermost secrets, my innermost pain, I don't think that it's crazy to expect that you get treated with respect for that. expect that you understand that it takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of humility, and a lot of just willing to be like, you know what, this sucks, but I want to help people. So making sure that there's an atmosphere for them to feel like, you know what, I'm not going to use you like the system used you. I'm not going to use you like everyone else has used you. And I'm going to make sure that you know that your voice not only matters, but it is taken seriously. Social capital, that's what comes to mind. As far as aftercare, we've given, like I believe Brittany, you said it, that most people have been doing this for years. So we've given you years of our life, years of reliving the same traumatic incidents over and over and over. I don't think that it's foolish to expect that you not only compensate us well, but also like check on us. Don't just drop us off, and don't just use. At the end of the day, I think that's what it boils down to for me. Don't just use people. Don't don't make us think that, okay, you know what, they're right, like everyone's always going to use me, and don't just further intensify the trauma that we've already experienced by just dropping us like a bad egg. If that makes any sense.
Makes a lot of sense, Kiki. Thank you for that. And thank you each for your answers and opening us up with that. Yeah, I think those are two huge pieces of building community, increasing people's social capital, and then ensuring that after you've invited young people with lived experience to the table, that you're caring about them beyond the moment, beyond the presentation or the panel or the speech or webinar, and really coming back to the center of it, which is that we're human, and asking to share such personal things with, like everyone said, with strangers. So I think that there are many challenges that come with being a lived experience advocate. I feel like we've all been there, and I know we've had long conversations about some of these challenges. And one that has come up in this conversation and other conversations is this balancing, or this challenge of balancing, professionalism and authenticity. And I put professionalism in quotes because I think that varies on by who you talk to. So my question for each of you is, as an advocate, what are the challenges of balancing professionalism and authenticity?
So for me, I think the balance of the struggle that I face with balancing professionalism with authenticity is I tend to be a very straightforward type of person. And my biggest thing is trying to figure out a way to say what I need to say, but also having that professionalism in a sense of like, okay, you know what? When I'm talking about group homes, they were terrible. They sucked. It was a lot of stuff that I didn't need to see. But then sometimes, it's really just trying to read the room, trying to speak my truth, but also trying to make sure that I speak my truth in a way to where they're going to take it in. So if I'm just blunt about it, I'm like, you know what, this sucked. It was terrible. I didn't like it, blah, blah. Now, certain people have already turned themselves off. So trying to figure out a way to say what I want to say, but not sugarcoat it, but say it in a way that everybody takes it in. And even if it hits you later, like, wait a minute, this is what she was actually saying. I want to make sure that my point gets across without people checking out midway through what I'm saying.
What I would add on to that is really the experience of like, there's already a box that is the expectation depending on the organization and the event and those types of things. So, you're not talking about like statistics, right, in math and algebra, or the concrete way that you grow a seed into an apple orchard. You're talking about like your specific raw human experience. And so I think with that specifically, it's like, your authentic self may not fit into that specific box that a lot of organizations have to fit a certain quota, to get a certain amount of money or donations, in the specific way that you show up in the world. So I think it's an internal dialogue of, what do you stand for? What do you feel connected to? And I think it happens over time, but for folks that are like, that are just getting into advocacy, or, navigating their professional journey, it's very much difficult because you have that passion and that drive to speak about something that you, particularly your family, has experienced. And it's just like, sometimes I think the expectation is to forfeit that authenticity, whether that has a lot more emotion to it. And it's like, well, we need to take that part out or tone it down a little bit. Don't focus too much on this part, and it's like you're molding and shaping yourself into whatever other people want you to show up as and share your story in that specific way. And I think that's particularly damaging for a population of people that have had to do that their entire life, or their entire experience, especially if they've been touched by child welfare. So really looking at that aspect of how do you prepare and support youth in sharing their authentic stories, and really be able to share, what happened without causing that internal damage to themselves, of course. But it shouldn't be like watered down or palpable for everyone else to feel like they have a certain quota, or meeting a certain $100,000, $500,000 that more than likely won't even get to the youth anyway.
Yeah, to add to that, it's interesting how around like the balance of professionalism and authenticity, like how even in spaces that are child welfare prevalent, if that makes sense, but that aren't meant to be the most professional, even in those experiences, it still feels like there's attitude, there's you basically, there's an expectation, I'll just say, of code switching. I've had the opportunity to be in more casual spaces with child welfare people, but like where I was still like, flown out to another state or something. And even in those spaces where it's like, we're not advocating today, no one has to share any story, like it's just a retreat, or it's just relax, it's just, whatever, build relationship. Even in these spaces, there's just like this expectation of professionalism, when really I think like above all, like it's clear that we need community. And those efforts should be prioritized to build that. I think community and having community heals. I think this kind of like, just this kind of like lone wolf mentality can be harmful in this I'll say system of advocacy. And I think that too, around like authenticity, I totally agree with so many points you guys have made so far. And I just think that, it is triggering. I'll agree that like code switching and having to code switch in these spaces, still, it just feels like more of the same in a little bit of a disappointing way. So I do encourage organizations to allow that, like allow this like space to be held where people can be where they're at, simply where they're at. Nothing crazy, but just the bare minimum of allowing people to exist where they're at, as long as everyone's safe, as long as if it's like, yeah, I feel like I have more radical ideas of just rooting back to practices of sovereignty and indigeneity, especially those communities' ideas around, like their ideas around community and what that should mean. I think rooting back to those things, I think is just like a goal of mine, and kind of like abolishing any system that's rooted in anything less than community. Is just like my mindset, but I don't always get to be that in those spaces. I kind of just have to like move at the pace, it feels like, of the child welfare systems. But if we're advocating, like, why don't we advocate like for the place like we believe it should be at, especially being the people who experienced it, not the people behind the door signing papers, like making the moves, but the people who are experiencing it every day firsthand. Yeah, so that's just like how I see it as well. It's like, you know, I'm like, the authenticity, I think, is what brings it home. Like, you can't have one without the other. You know what I mean? You gotta have professionalism, of course. But we also have to unpack what that even means. I feel like there's some kind of classist themes within the ideas of professionalism that still stand today. So just, and also considering like where youth often come from and the statistics they fight hard to beat. I think we have to consider like what these words even mean, or what the ideas of being a leader, what does it all mean? You know what I mean? Just thinking deeper about the spaces we're trying to create.
Yes, thank you, each of you. There's definitely a lot there, and as you can tell, I feel like each of us has definitely gone through this experience of, I think as Oneup said, maybe our stories doesn't quite fit in that box, and having to edit ourselves, or take out pieces of our story because it's making other people too uncomfortable, or any of those experiences. Yeah, it definitely is harmful at the hands of the same system that harmed us as children, but now as young adults. So I think that is hugely important for people to consider is, what are you actually asking of young people to do when you're asking them to edit or filter, or don't talk about that, but focus on this part of your story, and really letting that sink in, and seeing the whole person, I think is important. I think another component of this professionalism that we don't often talk about, in my personal journey into advocacy, I kind of stumbled on it. This was never something I intended to do. I was never like, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to talk to a bunch of strangers about my story. I'm going to make things happen. It never was on my mind. I kind of fell into it. And I think in that first, like, maybe 6 months of the national work, the state work, it was all happening at once, and it was go, 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 go. And it was so overwhelming. And I was like, I don't know if like I deserve to be in this spot. I don't know if I'm the right person, if my story is enough. So I'd like to kind of talk about that feeling of the imposter syndrome, because I think most of us, if not all of us, have felt that. So my question for you all is, have you experienced imposter syndrome during your advocacy journey? And if so, how did you navigate that experience?
Yeah, I could start and just say that, yes, I have absolutely experienced the phenomena of the imposter syndrome. And one way I navigated it was definitely just kind of expressing that, gauging the energy, the vibe of like the space, and if I felt safe enough you know, with certain people or with the whole group, there's been a few times where I have expressed, there's an imposter syndrome, and I hear it from my peers. I hear it from colleagues that I've worked with. And so it hits us all, but in varying degrees. And I think that we're all valid in like wanting to feel like we deserve the spot, we belong here. So again, I think just off like the idea of like inclusivity, like like the idea now that organizations, nonprofits more than ever are trying to incorporate special populations into their organization, historically marginalized and oppressed populations. But it's like, how are you then have the responsibility to make them feel like they belong, like they deserve to be there in some capacity. And I think in this realm of work, absolutely, like all the more, especially because we were 16, 17, 18, like advocating at young, vulnerable ages. And still, even now, I'm like, we're just figuring things out. I'm almost 30, and I'm still figuring so many things out. I'm just realizing like how some of the realities of this like system, and especially around advocating. So I just feel like, as far as like imposter syndrome, I remember getting accepted to like one of the first big things I was getting accepted to as far as like advocacy, and it involved other youth. And I remember all the more I applied, I heard back and I didn't get it. And then someone dropped out or couldn't make it once they like learned the dates or something. And so I did get the spot that was just kind of like the default spot. So even that, like, it's kind of hard to shift the mindset of like, I earned this, because it kind of feels like I was like a second choice. And I was young, like I was younger than I am now, of course. I was a few years ago. And like I said, it was one of my first like really big opportunities. Never got to like leave my state for advocacy yet. Like that was like my first experience with that as well. Going somewhere else, meeting new people. So yeah, I just, all that to say, I feel like, I think that we need to lead with the idea that people sometimes like don't often feel like they belong in these professional spaces because of the history of like the inaccessibility of them. So I think coming from that very recent history of like, years ago, like my grandma wouldn't have been in this space. My mother would not have been allowed in this space, but now I am. Like, I'm like maybe one of the first of my generation to be allowed in these kind of like professional spaces at this level, especially as I go on through advocacy and do more. So I think especially predominantly white organizations need to lead with the understanding that that is a historical and systemic like effect, and lead with that as far when they're talking about aftercare, when they're talking about creating the space for us. Just another responsibility of like, yeah, you need to actively acknowledge this and often and check in, because that syndrome, it can lead into really hard feelings. It can lead into like a lot worse, and it can affect one's mental health, like especially like as we've all kind of mentioned, we've all already been in spaces where we feel like we didn't belong. Foster care is literally being put in a place where sometimes just don't feel like you belong. It's new faces, it's new food, it's new rooms, it's new everything. So yeah, just being sensitive to the history and how that relates to the population they're trying to get to advocate. Foster care is literally being put in a place where sometimes just don't feel like you belong. It's new faces, it's new food, it's new rooms, it's new everything. So yeah, just being sensitive of the history and how that relates to the population they're trying to get to advocate.
So I guess I'll go next. I have experienced imposter syndrome, and how I deal with it is I used to there used to be certain parts of like my story I wouldn't tell because I was so used to being like tokenized for the, over 20 different group homes and this and that. And so I'd hear people talk about being put in, like foster homes, like family type settings. And so I would always be like, well, there was this one time where I did stay with a relative for like a couple months or so. So whenever I speak to people who've been in predominantly foster homes, that's the only thing I talk about, just so that I can have something to relate to them to. And it really made me feel as though like maybe, I don't know, because even though we were all in the system, I felt like I was kind of weird because I was like, well, why wasn't I in a foster home? Why was I only in group homes? Like, did a foster home just not want me? Like, did I not deserve to have the family setting? So for a long time, I really thought there was something like really wrong with me. I was like, well, you know what? Everybody else has been in a foster home. It hasn't been me. I had to get to a point where I realized I can't compare my story to someone else's story because we're not on the same journey. We may have had similar roads at one point in time, but the path that I'm on is not anyone else's path, so I can't expect my story to be exactly like theirs because we're just different people. And so now when I find myself having those thoughts where it's like, you know what, it doesn't really matter what you went through because you weren't in a foster home. No one wanted to adopt you. So clearly there's something wrong with you. I remind myself that like I'm on a different path and it is what it is. These are things that happen and I have to create my own destiny and I can't let that rule my life.
I've been trying to remember the question because I know there were multiple parts to it. Okay, have I experienced imposter syndrome? I don't know. I feel like I definitely felt excluded from a lot of spaces. I would say that when I was younger, like 19, I guess I was very frustrated in how I would be able to support system change in child welfare, or how could I make a difference? And it was because the way different definitions of success were kind of pushed, or mainstream definition of success was kind of pushed about, getting a certain degree and doing things a certain way that, in my personal experience, no matter how hard I strived to do those different things or attempt to, I had different barriers. Like my family was in poverty, so I had different things that I had to do, which then at that time made me feel like, what am I doing wrong? Like, I have other experiences and situations, especially always seeing kind of the same people in advocacy being uplifted in the same type of narrative of stories. And I was like, I wonder like what I'm doing wrong here. How can I like share and make a difference? And eventually I had to let all that shit go. But definitely at that time, it was just exhausting to try to, like, again, another box, fit myself and fit my story and fit my experience, which is also what I'm hearing my panel mates saying as well. Just really trying to mold yourself and then question your own story, your own experience, your own expertise, until eventually, you have to look at yourself and be like, okay, well, Like, what am I measuring the value of myself and my story up against? And is it even worth it? So I guess that's how I navigated that. It was like internal dialogues and trial and error, a lot of being in that space, feeling, like, oh, this person. Or another one that I would share too is I noticed that it kind of felt like anything other than like policy change and advocacy, anything else was kind of like it didn't matter. But policy specifically, if you were doing something in policy, then you mattered, your story mattered, what you did mattered. But any of the on the ground, like connecting with organizations, having those conversations, it was like minimized and made like it was on like small. And I guess still even now it's like a tier system of like, this level of advocacy and this level, and that's extremely damaging, because for the folks that you don't feel a calling to that particular element for the rest of your life, like you're not going to run for office, you're not going to do any of those things, that can be internalized as like, I'm never going to be good enough. And I'm never going to get there to whatever there means in the level of success. So I do think that it's an internal culture in advocacy and child welfare specifically that we can question and hold space to really like see where we're going with that, because it's very damaging to the folks that are doing the work on all levels. Because the folks that are doing the work in advocacy, because I think each and every one of us has been a part of some form of policy. And it's just kind of like, you have that to uphold. You have to keep doing that. You have to one up yourself and do more and do more and do more, which goes into burnout culture and a slew of other things. So what was the last question? What can spaces do to help youth navigating this experience? So starting a dialogue within the culture of your organization around, is there a culture of a tier system of advocacy? 2, are you validating those youth and experiences, stories, perspectives, humans, and really having for the youth and for advocates, adult advocates, really just like having space for ourselves to navigate those conversations. And I don't know who's going to start it, but somebody, and just really having space to debrief and have those internal conversations, because it definitely leads to what Brittany was saying, a lot of those mental health challenges, which I'm sure we're going to get into soon.
Yep, you do know. We're gonna get into that. Yes, I definitely agree with each and every one of you. And I think like building off of what Anho said about the tier system, or that constant having to one up yourself, right? I don't know if people recognize, but a lot of times as advocates, I feel like it's almost like a race, right? It feels almost like a race of who can go from, the bottom to the top as quickly as possible, and who's getting the invites to be on panels and webinars and speeches, and who's getting in the room, and you're competing with yourself and everyone around you, and it's stressful. It's so stressful. And I think that builds a culture of where you can't say no, right? Because there's a fear associated with saying no in advocacy world of, well, if I say no once, I'm never going to be invited back again, and my ranking is going to drop, right? Like this competitive nature. And I think that builds a lot of pressure up for many advocates, so much so that we have had to build this image of being put together at all times, and bringing in the mental health thing of not being able to just be in that, we have to just keep pushing through because we can't say no. So there is often that disconnect between the image of advocacy all put together and the reality of that experience. So that's what I was hoping to talk about next, was how has the image of advocacy affected your reality or your life?
So I'll start off this one. To me, the image of advocacy, going off of what Angela, I hope I pronounced it right. I'm so sorry if I pronounced your name wrong for years. But anyways, going off of what she said, like with the policy, I think when people think, so when the image of advocacy that was painted to me is that we're supposed to all be like doing political science, and we're all supposed to be wanting to run for president one day, or mayor, or some type of political office. And also we're supposed to, and this is personally speaking, I think that the image of advocacy is they expect us to look a certain way. And so that has negatively impacted me, because I've, like, the way my body type is, what I've had instances where I've been trying to do advocacy work, but instead of discussing any type of political things or any type of policies, the conversation has been about, oh, what are you going to wear? How are you going to cover this up? How are we going to, like, how's your body going to look? So it's been so focused on my outward appearance that it's like none of the advocacy that I do matters, because I don't fit the look of what an advocate is supposed to look like. And that's led to me I'm pretty sure I have an eating disorder by now. Like, it's led to me being like fixated on making sure that my body looks a certain way, or if for instance, like if I look a little too thick in something or a little too skinny in something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta do better. I gotta fix this, because I don't look right. And so it takes away the joy of being able to change the system, because I'm more focused on trying to make sure that I fit the bill of what an advocate is supposed to look like.
Wow, that was very powerful. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. Wow. I really also want to touch on something that you said, Veronica, around ranking. I thought that was a really great highlighted point. And that also goes into what Kiana was saying as well. And it's, the image of child welfare and as an advocate and having everything together and supposed to have made it, be fully healed, doing all the things, have figured everything out. It's so toxic because it's not like a real human image, right? Like, that's in general. So why is that a standard and expectation? Why is that so high for people that have lived experience in foster care? And the thing is, as advocates, we conform to that because we have to. And it goes back into a certain sense of survival mode. And like, this is how I have to perform and be and show up in order to get the kudos, get that invite, get that connection even, right? Like, there's the gatekeeping of resources, of even as adults with lived experience, like the gatekeeping of resources, the gatekeeping of community, which can be the most hurtful of all. If you don't look a certain way or have a certain story or present a certain way or are performative while you're going through whatever you're going through in life as a human, maybe you're in a season of life that 5 years ago, when you started the advocacy journey, you really thought you knew what you were doing with your life and you were serious. And that was 100% what you were, looking to do in that element. And then you're in a season of life where you're growing and you're evolving and you're seeing things differently. You're experiencing life differently and you're showing up differently. And now you can get gatekept out of being surrounded by other folks that have lived experience in advocacy, because now, you're in a different place. And again, going back to the tier system and what Veronica was saying, like ranking, like it's so damaging to your mental health that I know for me, like I definitely have considered like continuously like deleting all my social media, stepping away from everything child welfare, because there's that inner competition between folks, because that's also the culture and what organizations are fostering when you're only uplifting one particular experience and not taking into account what that means for the other folks that maybe applied for that position or applied for a space to be able to share their experience. That's the internalized and reaffirmed thought process that like my story isn't valuable. I'm not valuable. It goes right back to I'm not valuable. There's another rejection, another organization, agency, person that doesn't care about me. They only care about, and I think I felt like this recently. It was in 2020, actually after I released my book, and people started talking to me as if like I was a commodity. Started saying things like, yeah, we'll just have you up here, you know, it's going to be great for our marketing. We're going to, you know, get your name and let's talk about your title. What kind of title? Oh, this one's more marketable. And I just like, I remember I had like 2 days before that event, which I ended up not going because I was like, I don't feel like this is what I'm trying to do. And they were paying well, but it wasn't about that. It was about the culture and the way that they were just kind of like puppeteering almost. But I felt very like drained, and I felt like, man, this is really the last straw. Like this is like too much of erasing my humanness because I'm fitting a specific thing that at that time became popular because of the Black Lives Matter protests and all the things that were happening. And so spiritually, I was aligned in that way that my book was coming out. But on their end, on the organization's end, it was like a marketing ploy and like, this is great. Yeah, your book, let's support it. And that was extremely exhausting for me. And to think about, as I shared with you all, but like just all the suicide that has happened in our community for that pressure of trying to show up and, you know, trying to make a difference. And also on the back end, because you're so performative in your professionalism, you're not being authentic and honest and real with the relationships that you do have. And where is the space to be authentic and real? You know, with folks that think that they see you and they're like, oh, you have it all together. But where is that space that you can be human? You're like, you can take that off. Because I've noticed in the world in general, like sometimes you do have to be performative, but where are the spaces where you can take it off? Where are the spaces where you can communicate and have those conversations with other advocates and other people that have lived experience? Honest, raw conversations about how you genuinely feel. You know, if you're feeling shitty, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling like, hey, I don't know if I really want to show up to this event right now because I have this and this going on with my birth family, with, you know, those are real life situations, especially with people with lived experience. Your birth family coming to the picture, you found a new sibling. I mean, there's the crazy things that happen. Or just, you know, something came up that day mentally and you're struggling to get out of bed at that time. Where's the space for that? There is no space for that, because if you don't show up, then now you're unreliable and you're not you're not supposed to, you know, have those types of things because you've already made it. You have it all together. You're not supposed to have bad days. What are you doing? You're an advocate. You're supposed to be showing up for everybody else. And yeah, I don't think that that's fair. And I don't think that that's realistic as a human. So for me, it has affected my reality and my life just by one, at first, just feeling so bogged down by it and suffocated by it, and just trying to balance that within myself and be in harmony with myself about what are the opportunities that are actual opportunities, and how do I push back on this culture of this specific image that we're supposed to have and be professional. So I mean, I'm wearing a sweatshirt right now that says freedom. So it's more so about how do you really feel free in yourself and your story, and being authentic in who you are as an advocate, as a human, though, in general. Like that's another label, right? Advocate's a label, just like all the others. But really looking into your own skin and challenging that wherever you are, whether that is advocacy in an organization, in your work, or other spaces. And I'll pass it on to the next panel mate.
Yeah, so many great points. Oh my gosh, as usual, from everyone. And I definitely wanted to add, so many things were running through my head just now that I'm like, so many themes tie together. So many of these questions intersect in really cool ways that open up a conversation that I'm always willing to have. So just around like the image and how that disconnect has kind of happened. One of the first things like I wanted to comment on was just how it ties back into our last question, or one of the last questions about, sorry, it's not scrolling up. Okay. Oh, imposter syndrome and all of that. Like basically, I think it's interesting because I'm noticing a theme that we'll talk about in the next question more, but just like of ageism and classism, and a lot of isms and phobias tend to creep in basically just because that's how we're conditioned. And I think that we told us to silence our phones too. I think that basically, I'm noticing like another theme of like tying back into professionalism versus authenticity. I'm realizing now more than I ever have in my life that it just makes sense. Like I can think of any professional experience where I was having a hard mental health day or going through something outside of work, because believe it or not, like under capitalism, work is still not all of our lives. Like work is not all we do. We have relationships outside of this. We have lives, we have hobbies, we have books we like to read. You know, there's different things, topics, niches, passions that we have outside of this work. So I think that it's just interesting how there's a theme of like professionalism versus authenticity, as if like any other time outside of this, like I wouldn't be more of my authentic self. So like you're asking me to come into this space where we're talking about like very vulnerable, real things. And like, I never appreciate having to put on a certain image to be more digestible. But I understand it is necessary in some spaces to get the point across. But I feel like there are ways we're still being silenced. There are ways this image of advocacy versus like the reality of it is like affecting how much we're actually getting done. I think professionalism honestly sometimes can just be an excuse to stray away from authenticity, to not have to do those check-ins, to not have to worry about aftercare, because it's a workspace. This is a business space. You guys are on the clock. You guys are getting paid. Like, you know, I've heard all of that in these spaces. Like, but then the next second, like you're asking me to share about my experience being Black in foster care, like as if that's not very emotional, real, raw, like you said, like these are raw conversations, raw things we're sharing, like, yeah, not to be commodified. And I think talking about ageism too, and like how that ties in, it's interesting how it all ties into burnout culture and imposter syndrome, where because so much of this advocacy that brings us all together, and because we do crave that community, it is kind of like, it feels like sometimes like a trap of like, you know, like you guys said, like you feel like you can't say no anymore. Like you can't say no or else risk this, like lose this, like, and I'm also kind of like, okay, let me get my thoughts back together. But yeah, that's just kind of like talking about how like this image kind of is harmful sometimes. I think if we reevaluate what professionalism really means and what it should and could mean, then we can begin to create actual healing spaces where community and healing and real change is prioritized. Tangible, long-lasting change. You know what I mean? So we're talking about like how we're like more vulnerable when we're more valuable when we're younger. That's what it feels like. We're more valuable when we're younger, like when we're fresh out, but that's when we're most unhealed, when we've just, like, for me, I'll speak on my own experience. Like, I aged out of the foster care system, was living with friends, a friend's family, for like the summer after I turned 18. That wasn't the best fit because it wasn't a huge place and it was a lot of us in there. So I signed back in and I did age out like at I think just before my 20th birthday. So just like around that time, that's when I was really like advocating more and feeling, I do definitely realize like I've tied feeling more valuable back then. Like I felt more valuable because I was advocating more, because I was getting all these first new experiences. And it is frustrating how like, yeah, I've never realized until having these conversations just now with you guys, so many things about how even in my own state on a local level, I have been taken advantage of. And it's triggering and it's traumatized. It's triggering. Like we as foster youth have PTSD at rates 3-4 times higher than the average soldier. Like, and that is like the slightest things like that can be a huge spiral of like, well, who am I outside of my trauma to you guys? Who am I outside of what I can financially build, like give to you, or like what I could financially mean? Like, am I just like, I don't want to be looked at as like just like a dollar sign. You know what I mean? And I think that this image, all tying back together, like has done that to me. Like, I feel like as I'm getting older, there's less opportunities for advocacy. And like I said, I'll save some of that for the next question. But yeah, it's just kind of crazy how that all ties in together, and how we're seen as like, you know, not fully like, you know, real people with real experiences all the time. Yeah, I feel like there's this hesitancy in spaces to have that authenticity in the space, to share the more realer things about our stories, or how that affects us today and how we advocate. I, for one, like have no interest anymore in code switching as much or being tokenized. Yeah, I personally, just to share really quick too, like I lost a sibling who went through foster care with me, my big brother, just 3 years ago tomorrow, actually. And just after that, like, I'm glad for me, it's not one of those things where it's like, oh, it took that for me to get more serious about it, but more like in the best way possible. Yeah, like it took that for me to see it. And like my brother's mental health issues tie directly into the failures of the child welfare system today. And this image is one of those. I think that's why, you know, even he never really advocated like I did. He didn't do, you know, any of the work that I did, and that's okay. I think there's expectation that we have to. Sorry, my whole screen froze. I'm not sure if you guys can still hear me.
We can still hear you.
Okay.
We just can't see. It's just frozen in one image though.
I think if you stop your video and then put it back on, it might help.
True. I'll be quiet, but if someone else wants to share, that's okay. But yeah,
I'm actually gonna switch us over to our next question just in the interest of time.
For sure.
Not that I don't want to hear and continue this conversation, but we do have a few more questions to get through. And I think one of the things that has come up a few times, and Brittany has brought it up, is the label of youth, right? I think that each of us, and correct me if I'm wrong, but each of us entered into this advocacy world as a youth advocate, specifically kind of tied that in. And for context, I feel like many lived experience advocacy opportunities tend to go from 16 or 18 to about 25. There's like a window for many of us where we're at the front and center of advocacy, but as youth advocates. And once we hit that 25, 26 area, all of a sudden you see a huge drop in opportunities to speak. You see a huge drop in being able to be in the room in some of these spaces. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that regarding this almost culture of aging out of youth advocacy. Like, what are the challenges of this aging out dynamic, and how can organizations better support young adults in reaching their next level once that happens?
For me, one of the challenges of aging out is that, I mean, when you first start, especially as a youth, you don't really realize that you're being used. And I mean, I don't know the nice way to say it, so I'm just going to be blunt. You don't realize that you're being used for your story. You honestly think that these organizations care about your story, they care about your pain, they care about your trauma, they care about changing the system. And as you get older, you start to realize you're nothing more than just a hot ticket. And I think the reason it's difficult to find opportunities past 25 is because society no longer sees you as a young adult. You're now just an adult like everybody else. Nobody cares anymore. So they don't get as much funding, and they won't get as much of whatever they're trying to get from you at that age. And then it's crazy because once you age out, you've given these people all these years, and it's just kind of like, you just kind of toss aside like a rag doll. And then they just go get the next new bright-eyed person, bushy-tailed young advocate, ready to change the world, change the system that raised them. And then once you get to about 23, 24, that's it. And then you would expect, and I'm sorry, I'm about to rant for a little bit. You would expect that after all this time you've given to them, it's that they would at least look out for you, like, hey, we know you're turning this age. These are the opportunities. This is how you can segue into a different division, but still advocate. Instead, it's the most toxic relationship I've ever been in. And it's going to continue until somebody does something differently and acknowledges that we're not just puppets so that you can get money. We're actually people, and you need to respect that. And I forgot a question. I'm sorry.
You're fine. Thank you, Kiki. The question was regarding the culture of aging out of youth advocacy. What are the challenges of this aging out dynamic, and how can organizations support young adults in reaching their next level?
Okay, so I did the challenge part good. I got half of it right. The second part, how agencies can help is, if you know that a youth is about to age out of a certain position, like if their 2-year, 3-year mark is coming up, just let them know, like, hey, I know that we're about to roll you off, but here are new opportunities, or here's some opportunities that we've worked with or you've worked with in the past, and they're looking for a program coordinator, they're looking for a social media person or something. Let them know what other organizations are hiring, and if they are interested in being a part of that, give them references. Like, don't just be like, oh, well, good luck, I'll see you later. And give them resources.
Brittany, Oneup, any thoughts, comments on this one?
Do you mind putting the question in the chat? When I switched laptops, I lost the Google Doc.
So for me, I think that for me, it's definitely the element of youth advocacy in general. I think that this should be a lived experience paid position. If folks, and more so optional, if folks are looking to have that be their contribution to an organization. So whether that is an employee position, a contractual position, I think that when we a lot of times think about youth, because I got really frustrated the other day and I was like, stop calling me a youth. Yeah, like I was so mad. I was talking to somebody in community that's also doing a lot of advocacy. And I think I was 24. And I was just like, why do they keep calling me a youth? Like I'm an adult. Like I don't understand. Is that like what is it? And I like really dissected why I was so upset about it, because they're like, well, I guess technically you're still a youth. I was like, am I? Like, really? But I realized that the core of the reason why I felt that way was because I felt like it was less respect. It was less respect when someone calls me a youth. And, you know, it kind of is an excuse to not pay me for my experience and expertise. So that was exhausting. But I think to the question, the culture of aging out of youth advocacy, I think that's mainly the focus, at least the way I see it, is that there has to be a difference in the way that we're seeing advocacy, because advocacy right now is like as if, you know, we're middle age or late age, old white folks that have, you know, extra time on our hands, and we're just coming to, I mean, you know, 16, 18, 20, 30. I mean, you're trying to build your life and your experience professionally. You're trying to have some financial stability, especially coming from a system like child welfare. So I feel like there's not enough of that focus on like where youth or people with lived experience are coming from, especially on the element of classism, education level and financial literacy level. Where are those elements that are being supported? Like there shouldn't be a thing of aging out in general, but the culture of how we're even looking at it, I think is just 100% just backwards. Like you're looking at it as if we just have a lot of time on our hands and can come and do it for free or $25 or whatever. And like we already have our own investments and everything in the back end. Like that's not like, you know, for a lot of youth, there's not a clear conceptual understanding that like what volunteer and what that means. And secondly, well, they understand that that's free, but like what that means for a lot of people, and the culture of even volunteer is, yes, you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart, but you have the time and the resources in order to expend that time and energy. So I think that's one piece that I definitely wanted to share. And the second, how can organizations support youth in reaching their next level? Really, there's a lot of different trainings around like strategic sharing, but I also think going back to the human piece, if you know that youth is struggling in crisis mode, even still in survival mode on certain elements, and you can tell just from a conversation, it's not rocket science. Like you can have a conversation and you can tell this person is in survival mode. And for those that are more performative and show up and do all the things, I was that youth that you couldn't tell because I dressed to the nines, and I mean my skin told it all because I had terrible acne, but everybody just ignored that part. And it's just kind of like, you know, really getting into it and having an actual conversation about what's happening, you know, because there was a lot of spaces where I stepped up to try to speak, and because I had so much going on at home, housing instability, I was confused about like where I was going to be in life. I was trying to like navigate transferring to this other university, and I didn't know, you know, where I was going to live. And then I was also dealing with like food stuff. And then my siblings were in foster care still. So like trying to navigate that. And those are the types of things that we were going to be talking about. And I was like, I mentally and consciously, I was like, yeah, I can do this. I'm here, you know, have my dress or my suit, whatever I was wearing. And when it came to the actual time, my mental health completely failed, because it was just kind of like, what are you doing? Like, you need to take care of you first. So I think more focus on that well-being aspect, and the other element around really just looking at the culture of advocacy in itself, and how volunteerism has really kind of like been structured historically, and how is that actually benefiting youth and folks with lived experience, when this is one expertise speaking, you sharing your experience, your story. And when you're looking at that level of like compensation and professionalism, like really dissecting what that means as well. And it doesn't always mean a $25 gift card, no follow-up, no connection. Actually, it never means that. So what would that mean for your organization? If you do want to bring in lived experience, which you should, and especially if those are the issues that you're targeting, what is the space that you have in order to support that mentally, financially, physically, emotionally? I would dare even say spiritually, but that's another conversation for another time. You know, just open your mind, expand your mind, and especially if you're, you know, leading that organization, leading those conversations. And the way that it's going now is very harmful. And a lot of youth and folks with lived experience don't understand how much damage they're getting themselves into. Like, I definitely didn't. And I know a lot of folks in community as well, until after. And then you're like, oh, this is what's going on. And, you know, that shouldn't be the case, especially if you're in your heart and in your mind, you know, like you just want to support and do something well, like that you should, it's for the betterment of the system, for the betterment of other folks that are coming behind you. And that shouldn't be forfeited because there's not sustainable support on all ends to make sure that you're the right mind, you're in the right space, you're stable, you're connected, you have a community. That shouldn't be a question. If you're advocating, you should have supports and resources around that in order to help you sustain and continue to advocate. And maybe you would be able to do, you know, that take the $25 free or $50 if there's spaces where all the other elements are taken care of on the back end. And, you know, you have housing, you have connections to your career, if anything in child welfare isn't necessarily your career. And organizations are supportive of that dynamic versus just, you know, how old are you? All right, you're aging out of that. And cool that you shared your story, but it's expired. Your story has expired. And so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next, however old, however young individual, and no support.
I agree. I can't help but like, just in the protectiveness of my mind around youth and my peers and people who have also gone through these hard things, and just all the special populations that I hold near and dear to my heart, especially as I intersect with many of them. Just out of that, I think I like that we're like thinking deeply about this and sharing this, because it definitely does feel as if like it's more you have to like provide
No, okay, so basically like where I'm coming from is this mindset of like it kind of feels predatory almost. The system sometimes can seem predatory, and I know that word feels sometimes heavy or with this such a negative connotation, but just to know that like there's definitely varying degrees of preying in what that can look like. There's definitely varying degrees of grooming and what that can look like, honestly, if we're being real. And it can happen in the professional space. And what I think is happening sometimes with these organizations, I'm not sure if they're even, always thinking too deeply about it as much as they should. But I think sometimes what happens is they think that the 1-2 time or 3-year policy like team thing like that experience is enough. Like they're doing enough for us, or like we should just be grateful for that. And I understand it, because it's like, okay, yeah, we can put that now on a resume. We have gained policy writing experience, and it looks good on paper for sure, but I'm sure we're all aware where it's like not enough. And I feel like advocacy spaces have, like, again, more of a responsibility to be more authentic in their plans for us, if that makes sense. I think, like, I like the idea, Kiki, of just like hooking us up with opportunities, like, but no, I feel like, again, there's like a gatekeeping of the resources, gatekeeping of opportunities, and you have to fit a certain image, or have built a certain image by a certain point to be good enough to continue on in advocacy past the ages that they usually cut us off at. And the reason why I say it's predatory, and like almost sometimes, because it's because just basically like we're taking people right after they kind of are aging out. They're right as they're most vulnerable, versus like adults, like young and 30s and 40s, foster people who have experienced the child welfare system. And I know it's changed over the years, but these people are still experts. They'll always be experts. And I think not at all to push on us like the race of like being healed or anything like that. But I do think that over time, as we leave these systems, or whatever that looks like, some of us like are adopted, like, as some of us like, so yeah, just as we leave like the systems as minors, I think over time we only become more healed, more of an expert, more aware, more time to think about, what did I go through? How does that connect to who I am now? And I think there is absolutely, if not more value in older people advocating. I think it gives the younger advocates someone to look up to, which I don't ever remember really having, and so much more. There's just so many benefits to it. So I think just reevaluating, like, why do we highlight youth so much? Like, where are we thinking that sympathy is going to be garnered, and why? And it all, I think, ties into like ageism as well, and things like that, and our ideas around how many accomplishments we should have by what age and things like that. So yeah, I think we should be valuable if we've never advocated before but started doing it at 32. I think we should still be valuable, like with no an experience under our belt except the lived experience. So yeah.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, each of you, for your very thoughtful responses on this topic. I want to shift gears for our last question. I think throughout this conversation, I think we have established that we are all aware of the challenges of being a lived experience advocate. and some of the struggles and some of the unspoken things that we tend to face. But I think what I'd like to end on is really like even with all that awareness of all these things that are happening, why do we keep showing up? And like what is behind it? Why do we keep pushing ourselves and and just keep showing up? So that's my question for you all is, why do you continue to do this work, and what is your hope for the future in regards to lived experience advocacy?
So why do I keep showing up? As frustrated as I get with the lack of respect I feel, in my personal opinion, I feel like it's extreme lack of respect for me in my past, in my trauma. I still show up because there are youth in care right now that need someone to speak out on their behalf. And if I have to be uncomfortable, and if I have to go out here and be uncomfortable and be tokenized just so that there is some form of policy change so that their life can be better, at the end of the day, you know, it's worth the irritation on my end. My hope for the future for the system is that we're no longer needed. I mean, I think it's crazy that it's been decades and we're still having the same conversations, and everyone wants to sit around the table and talk about, oh, that's crazy, we need to do this, but yet no one's doing anything. So my hope is that as organizations stop talking and start walking. Like, let your actions speak louder than your words, because everyone's sitting around talking about how bad it is, but no one's trying to put out the fire. So that needs to be dealt with.
So I continue to do this work, and thank you, Kiana. They do. For me, the reason why I continue to do this work is because it's just something that I can't not do. It's always coming through in my head. I'm always thinking about it, whether that's like not necessarily my personal traumas anymore, really like that, but mainly like other families, other youth. I guess because my work is specifically around holistic healing and health and wellness for youth and adults to have lived experience. I'm always having conversations with people, so it's still always fresh. And I've continued to do that work because I think it's extremely imperative. And when I released my book in 2020, it was something that I knew was a gap. And so for me, part of my own purpose is one, lifting the consciousness of the world, but specifically with child welfare, elevating the folks that have already been doing 20, 30, 40 years of work, and how are we bridging those gaps? So that, to Kianda's point, that several decades in foster care has been, as we know it today, over 126 years. So it's just, you know, daunting to me. And it's not something that is exclusive from my own life experience. Like, it's not like I'm getting a pat on the back, you know, for doing certain things. It's been a lot of years of internal choice, internal calling to do something to support this. And I think over time, I've been able to figure out my own space and my lane to contribute. But it's extremely difficult because there's always like red tape across things, right? So like the point of actually making a difference, but to make a difference, there's like all this red tape and boxes that you have to conform into. So it's like navigating those different things. I continue to do the work because it's painful to see such small difference positively in this space. So I started my own company and wrote my own book. And so it's finding your own space, whether that's using your voice through music or painting or policy, or, you know, there's so many different ways to contribute. My hope for the future is that folks with lived experience come together and, you know, we build some pretty amazing revolutionary stuff that directly targets these issues, so that way they are alleviated, as well as sustainable financial funding and community-based work that isn't performative, and we have those healing spaces for ourselves, for every constituent that's in the child welfare system, and that the policy isn't only supporting the capitalist venture of foster care, which is $1 billion industry, but perhaps us being able to come together to find or create a separate entity, since, you know, that is the systemic way that it is operated in, is for-profit $1 billion. That also means power. So looking at how can we create our own power structures that are sustainable and actually able to create those shifts in child welfare, the ones that we genuinely need and need now, not in another 100 years.
Yes, thank you guys so far. Yeah, really like inspiring my own answers. So, and like my own thoughts around like why do I? That's always important to like check in. I think why we continue to do the work. And I think partially, like I mentioned earlier, you know, I did go through a few, like over 10 of the homes that I was in, I was in with my brother. And so like, and just meeting so many other foster youth along the way, as like often the homes that I was in, they were licensed for more than one child. So I was almost never alone in a foster home. So I just like always had these relationships I was building with people who had so many different stories. Like each of our stories is so unique. And so like for them, for my brother, and like now I'm kind of learning like more to prioritize and center myself in a healing and a healthy way. And for me as well, for like, I always have repeated like through the years, as I advocate, that I want to be the person that I needed when I was younger. And that means like, I think that to me, like that statement, that kind of like affirmation, I think like I'm healing my inner child in real time every time I advocate. I think that's why I do the work. I think that's why like I continue, because outside of the change we're making, these relationships that I've built, like with you all, even in this short time, and I know I've known, you know, some of you guys a little bit longer, but even in this short time in our long lives, our long 20-something-year-old lives, we've known each other like it's been insurmountable. It's just been so healing, so grounding. It's literally changed who I am, and how I view my past and my story in some of the best ways. Like honestly, other youth are one of the best parts of this advocacy in my experience for me, the friendships. Yeah. And so I think that all of that to say, like the root of it all for me is people who have experienced it. For them is like why I do this work. And despite all of, you know, the kind of like exploitation that we can experience, the tokenization and all of that we've talked about today. And my hope for the future It's pretty radical. Pretty like, it shouldn't be seen as like this extreme thing, but for some reason it is extreme to want to just come down to the baseline and fix the root of so many of these systems that I wouldn't even say are broken. They're working how they were intended to work. We're trying to fix from within, I think, something that is rooted in some of the worst things humans have created, i.e. capitalism, white supremacy, and racism, and all the things, all the horrors that are the root of so much pain and hurt on our globe. So I think that's like my hope for the future, is really just like the abolishment of those systems. And like I said earlier, rooting back to indigeneity, returning to the systems that were working beautifully, returning to the systems that didn't forcibly remove children from their homes. Yeah, like, and creating new ones that we haven't even imagined yet. Kind of stepping out of the imagination of white supremacy, because we're living in that imagination right now. Like that's the dream we're told to aspire to, is something within white supremacy, something within and still under capitalism. But my wildest future, my wildest hope is outside of all of that. And it's centered around healing.
Beautifully said, stated, projected out there to the world. Yeah, I just have to say I'm so grateful for each of you for going deep into this conversation with me around lived experience and advocacy. I think it's a huge topic, especially as it becomes more popular. And I think that all three of you did a wonderful job of shedding light on the reality of this experience. And I'm sure many are going to be able to relate to you. And my hope is for that people who watch this, organization, providers, hopefully my hope is that you take some of this to heart and see the person behind the advocate, right? See the humanity in each of us. Because we're out here pushing ourselves hard every day to show up, even though this experience isn't easy. So I appreciate each and one of you showing up, and we'll go ahead and end here. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our first panel conversation on lived experience and advocacy. I hope that you're able to take some of what our panelists shared with you today and bring it into your own life and your own work. I want to also say a huge thank you to our panelists, Kianda, Brittany, and Angela, for sharing their hearts and their experiences and stories with us. This is not an easy thing to do, as you heard in that conversation, so I have so much gratitude and respect for each of you and what you do. I also want to give a very big thank you to my home organization, Casa First, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates, First Judicial District, based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. This project would not have happened without their support, and so I'm incredibly grateful to them. I also want to say thank you to our executive director, Annie Rasquin, for always letting me dream big and supporting me and making these big dreams happen. I don't know where I would be without you, so thank you so much, Annie, for your support. I also want to mention a few more things before I end our video for today. So our next conversation will be on the perspective of Indigenous youth on child welfare, and that'll air on June 3rd. So keep your eye out for that conversation. I will be joined by another 3 incredible individuals to dive into that conversation. And also, if you haven't already, please follow us on social media to keep up to date with the videos and what's happening with our panelists. On Facebook, you can find us at Casa First. On Instagram, you can find us at Casa_First_. And then if you want to keep up or learn more about what the Court-Appointed Special Advocates do, please visit us at www.casafirst.org. All right, I appreciate you so much, and I hope you are able to listen to the rest of our conversations. Have a wonderful day.